evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions. Controversial Canadian free speech warrior Lindsay Shepherd, Tasmanian Liberal Senator Eric Abetz, the radical Christian philosopher Dr Cornel West, who's on a national debating tour for Think Inc. People's panellist Jeremy Bell, a philosopher and historian who describes himself as a conservative Catholic, and West Australian Labor MP Anne Ali. Please welcome our panel. Thank you very much. Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. And our first question tonight comes from Ian Neal. Go ahead, Ian.
AGL 2018 net profit was $1.6 billion. It rose by approximately 200% from the previous year. Competition is avoided like the plague, Liddell Power Station being a classic example. Power bills are pushed up, gay abandoned regularly. It is time there is a government control to stop this arrogant, aggressive billing. How can this be solved?
Eric Abetz.
Well, we're starting with the easy questions first, so thank you very much for that. Look, Australia does have a problem. 20 years ago, we had the cheapest energy in the world. 20 years later, we are now, I think, the second most expensive in the world. Something's clearly gone wrong with our energy mix and the way that we do business in this area, and that is why I believe that we do need to have a very close look at the Paris Agreement, and I, for one, a year ago already was saying that we should be putting our pensioners before Paris. We are blessed with coal, we are blessed with uranium, we are blessed with hydro, and in all the circumstances we should be able to be providing our fellow Australians with the cheapest energy in the world, which would then enhance our standard of living, our household budgets and our capacity to be able to compete in the world markets.
Eric, the questioner was asking about what he called arrogant billing from these large power companies. Barnaby Joyce is in the news today saying there should be a plan B. The government needs a plan B. The NEG is not enough. It needs to be able to threaten power companies. It will break them up into smaller companies if they don't actually produce lower bills. What about that idea?
Oh, look, I was one of those that was of the view that the federal government should give serious consideration to taking over Liddell if AGL were not prepared to sell it to somebody else rather than just closing it down. Because you are right, the AGL business model was simply close down a power station, and what do you get? Less production,
yes, but
less
that wasn't the question.
Higher prices.
Eric, that wasn't the question. Barnaby Joyce had an idea. The idea is to literally threaten the power companies, that they will be broken up individually, made into smaller companies, if they don't produce lower power bills, presumably to create greater competition. Is that a good idea?
Oh, look, that is a view that Barnaby has. Chances are it is a potential answer, but in relation to Liddell, if the federal government would have said, you either sell or we take it over, AGL would have known the game was over, and they would have either have had to have continued with Liddell or sold to somebody else, given the threat of a government takeover. Sadly, the government of which I'm a part of was not of that view, and that is one of the reasons why we continue to have these higher energy prices. As we are meeting here, or people are viewing Q&A, my backbench colleagues are meeting in Canberra discussing this very issue, so I look forward to being briefed on it tomorrow morning when I return to Canberra.
Yeah, so a final question for you before I move on, but do you agree with your old friend Tony Abbott that the NEG, the National Energy Guarantee, is seriously bad policy? Because he's actually threatening to cross the floor if it comes to Parliament. Would you do the same thing?
What I've said about the National Energy Guarantee is that it's a framework. There's still a lot of flesh to be put on the bones, and we still don't have all the detail, and until such time as we have all the detail, I think it's premature to say that you fully support it or that you fully oppose it. But it seems to me that the driver behind the NEG is the Paris Agreement, and India's not bound by it, China isn't bound by it, nor is the United States. And when you've got the three major emitters in the world, irrespective of your view on anthropogenic climate change, no matter what your view, the simple fact is us doing our alleged bit in relation to Paris will not make one scintilla of difference to the world environment, but will make a huge difference to our economic well-being, to jobs and standard of living in Australia, and that is why I have very real concerns, but I await to see the final result.
And Ali?
Oh, I think it's quite astounding that we still don't have a national energy policy. In 2016, we had an emissions intensity scheme on the table. Labor was prepared to support it. It was vetoed in the coalition party room. In 2017, we had a clean energy target on the table. Again, Labor was prepared to support it. Again, it was vetoed in the coalition party room. So I think at the moment the biggest challenge that we have to energy security in Australia is a government that can't come to an agreement about a national energy policy. I think it's a dire situation. We need to get something through. Obviously, Labor is willing to work with the government on the NEG, but the biggest challenge to that is a cohort within the coalition.
OK, we're going to find out tomorrow if Malcolm Turnbull manages to get it through the party room. Will you then support it if they do? Because if your only objection is he's not going to get it through his own party room, and he does, aren't you bound to support it?
Well, there are problems that we do have with it, and we've expressed those problems. One of the problems is that the target is a very weak target. It's a target that will not set a investment environment that will encourage not a single project for renewable energy in Australia over the next decade. We'd like to see a stronger target. The target at the moment of 26% is very, very weak, or at least the flexibility for states to be able to set their own targets. And that's what the states have been asking for as well, the flexibility within the framework to be able to change the target that it currently is. So
when you come to government, you want to make the target higher, is that what you're saying?
Well, I would imagine that would be what Labor would do.
You would not believe.
Well, that's not what the modelling is showing. The modelling is showing, and we know, that renewables are actually cheaper than
Why do we need the subsidies then? Why do we need a renewable energy?
Eric, I'm going to just interrupt you because we've got a question from Sam Shepherd. It's on the same subject, and then we'll move on to broader issues that the rest of the panel can talk about. Sam, go ahead.
The modelling for the National Energy Guarantee makes it clear that there will be no new investments in wind and solar for nearly a decade. Why is that a good thing, and why does the government think it can or should stop the future?
Sam Parkinson, I should have said. Eric,
well, look,
that's the point that was just being made by Anne Ali, which is that the way this NEG is set up, it will actually stop renewable energy projects.
Well, the first and vital point from my perspective is we want affordable energy. The simple fact is that the pursuit of renewable energy targets has driven the cost of power up beyond anybody's imagination. Indeed, we had a review that told us that renewable energy was driving down prices, and that was part of the assumptions in the Finkel review. And they said the next movement in price would be down. A fortnight after that review came out, what happened? An 18% increase in the cost of energy. So when people make these brave predictions, and I've been around politics for a while now, I have seen these brave predictions like the Brisbane River won't flood anymore, the Murray River won't flow out to sea anymore, there won't be any ice on the Arctic. All these brave predictions being made, all wrong, wrong, wrong. In relation to energy prices, similarly, brave predictions, and that is why when I see modelling and people give me these brave predictions, I just ask the simple question, what is driving the cost? And the simple fact is that it has been the renewable energy target that has been partially responsible for that increase.
Cornel, you've been listening to this, and of course Donald Trump, famously decided not to go ahead with, or to not sign the Paris Agreement or take away America's agreement on Paris. So how does this debate sound being echoed back over on this side of the debate?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, you all are wrestling with national energy. In the United States, we're running out of civic energy. And what I mean by that is a deep commitment to public life, high-quality public education, public conversation, the things that hold democracies together, the glue that constitutes the very raw stuff of very fragile experiments called democracy. So in the case of Donald Trump, you get not just the tribalism, the polarization, the balkanization, the manipulation of the language, the scapegoating of the vulnerable, the machismo identity. One can go on and on and on, dot, dot, dot.
And I'm not going to let you do that because I've got a specific question that'll allow you to do that.
Absolutely.
And just respond to what Eric Abetz said, because you were making that point before the questioner. Is it actually the case, though? I mean, you get back into government, you can turn the target into whatever you want.
I'd just first of all like to thank Sam for his question, and you're absolutely correct about the future and the future of energy in Australia. The other point to make, though, is that reducing emissions in energy is much cheaper than reducing emissions in other sectors such as transport and manufacturing. We have an emissions target. We need to honour that emissions target. How we do that is the question, and any kind of national policy should do two things. It should aim to guarantee supply, and it should aim to also meet our emission targets. Every modelling out there, and I have a wonderful company in my electorate called Sunvatec, who have developed battery storage for solar and an inverter system. They're waiting for a national policy that sets the environment for them to be able to attract investment so that they can move on with their project and supply these to the markets. Yes, we have a lot of coal. Guess what, Eric? We also have a lot of sunshine. We also have winds, and we also have tides. And if other countries can move on to renewables and produce cheaper electricity, so can we.
I'm just going to go to our...
Tony,
make a brief point.
Yeah, if I may quickly, part of our policy is also to include pumped hydro in the Snowy scheme with a substantial investment, and I hope we all agree that hydro is in fact a renewable source of energy.
OK. Jeremy, People's panellist, you're from Western Sydney. The concern about power prices is supposed to be huge in Western Sydney. Do you feel that yourself?
To be honest, no, but that's partly because I hadn't been in Western Sydney very long. I teach out there. I used to drive an hour there or do public transport for 1.5 hours, indeed. Well, that's the thing. I've had power bills, I think 2 of them so far, and they're not nearly as high as I feared they would be. My bigger worry is about being able to afford a house in the future at this stage. But ask me again in 12 months' time and maybe I'll sing a different tune.
OK, let's move on. Remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Jane Layton. Jane?
Hi, I'd like to direct my question to Cornel West. You have said that you believe the US is spiritually bankrupt. Do you think capitalism, with its emphasis on external goods and promotion of self-interest, has contributed to the loss of a moral compass in business and society? And do you think a more ethical form of capitalism is possible?
Oh, my dear Sister Jane, that's a very difficult question. We need a seminar to really come to terms with its complexity. But I would certainly say that the American empire, the very fragile experiment of democracy that's circumscribed by the empire, is experiencing a spiritual blackout. What I mean is a relative eclipse of integrity, honesty, and decency. The escalation of corruption, mendacity, criminality, people obsessed with just getting over, obsessed with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. And that's not just the business class, but we can start there. It's true in the working class. It's true. It cuts across institutions. And it's also tied to the imperial meltdown. American is an empire in relative decline and deep decay. And by deep decay, I mean just looking at the souls of its young people. I'm very inspired looking at the eyes of these precious young folk here in this audience. When you look at the children in the United States, 1 out of 2 black children live in poverty, the richest nation in the history of the world. 22% of all American children live in poverty, richest nation in the history of the world. But then the poverty in their souls. Titillation, stimulation, rather than deep care and nurturing. too many uncared for, unloved. The market forces shaping them into a culture of superficial spectacle and image rather than character, virtue, concern with the other. The narcissism, the hedonism, the nihilism that shot through the culture. You can see it in Hollywood, you can see it on the streets. And all we have left is prophetic fight back. And I've come from the legacy of Martin King, of Dorothy Day. She's my favorite Catholic. I know we got a Catholic brother here. Of Dorothy Day, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, our deep Jewish brother, Edward Said, Palestinian brother. These are American giants, and they are as American as apple pie. Now, Donald Trump is as American as apple pie. It's just that his America is triumphing, and the America of Martin Luther King Jr. right now is wrestling with defeat. But we're bouncing back.
Yeah, Cornel, you've called this one of the darkest moments in American history. When you think about
we've had a lot of competition. We had a lot of competition.
Well,
yeah. 750,000 precious Americans lost in the Civil War. Yeah. The Civil War was about what? Making sure black people are in slavery in perpetuity. That's what Jefferson Davis, that's what Alexander Stephen, the president, vice president of the Confederacy was. So that was very
I was going to go. You mentioned Martin Luther King.
We had Abe Lincoln. Now we got a Donald Trump. That's a hell of a decline there.
Yeah, but it's a huge comparison to make. I mean, you know, it's a relatively prosperous. Unemployment's coming down. Economic growth rate's coming up. More black people with jobs, more Hispanics with jobs. I mean,
but wage stagnation still.
That's true.
Wealth inequality increasing. Don't let the statistics hide and conceal the suffering. If it's just about growth and you're saying nothing about the fact that people who have 2 jobs still live in poverty. So we got higher employment. They're still suffering. Top 1% of the population still own 41% of the wealth. So don't allow the numbers to mislead you. But I do acknowledge the degree to which the numbers are better now than they were before, but they're still too narrow. Keep track of the lived experiences of our fellow human beings, no matter what color or sexual orientation or gender they are. That's the crucial thing, and not just in America, but in any other country.
Okay, Jeremy, you're a philosopher. Spiritual bankruptcy in the United States, do you see that?
I lived in the United States for the better part of 5 years. I saw very little of it, really. I lived in Chicago, but as Cornel would know, the University of Chicago is very close to the one of the poorest areas for black people that you can imagine. I did a certain amount of social work, for want of a better word, in that area, so I saw some of it firsthand. I think, yes, there's spiritual, I don't know what word to use, really. Corruption was one word that you used. I'm inclined to agree with that. I'm not sure that I would blame, not that you are blaming capitalism for all of it, I know, but I'm not sure how exactly capitalism comes into that. I think, as a Catholic, I'm not about to defend capitalism to the end of the road, but at the same time, there is some truth in the claim that, look, capitalism has made not just America, but the Western world as relatively rich.
Doesn't capitalism sit well with Catholics? Is that what you're saying?
Does it?
Doesn't it? Why wouldn't you defend it as a Catholic?
Well, where to start? It is St. Paul who says, or at least he's often quoted as saying, money is the root of all evil. That's scripture. Whether you're Catholic or not, that's scripture. The Catholic Church does, in my opinion, still condemn usury, which is arguably at the very base of capitalism. The Church has fallen silent about that. There's about so many other things, but I think it's perhaps time for a revival.
We've got a banking royal commission, that might help.
It might indeed, yes. The late 19th century and early 20th century popes were very clear that the world was in a dire mess and that it was so important for people not to think that capitalism was a panacea for the world's ills. Having said that, there are some Catholics, non-Catholics as well, conservatives, who say, well, OK, but what's the alternative? In all honesty, I'm not sure what the alternative is. I'm presuming it's not socialism. There are people who talk about distributism, which is associated with the Catholics G.K. Chesterton and Adair Belloc, which, whatever else it means smaller communities, less centralised communities, the deep state being dismantled to a large extent, less militarism, fewer armies, all of these things which sound good. How exactly it works, if it can be made to work, I'm not sure.
Let's go to our next question. It's related, and our answerers can reflect on both the questions. Michael Ferenc.
Dr. West, you've said that Donald Trump is a symptom rather than a cause of the current situation in the States. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, what's the cure? And for us in Australia, are we in danger of being infected by the same causes?
Well, one is that the last thing you want to do is fetishize any individual, even somebody in the White House. By fetishize, I mean ascribe magical powers. That's what I mean by he's as American as apple pie. He comes out of a rich tradition, but it's a rich tradition in a negative way. Hatred, contempt, using your insecurity to put others down rather than your vulnerability to embrace others. And so rich may have been the wrong word, but I'm talking about a deep, that's what I want to say, a deep tradition. I think Donald Trump is a gangster. Now, what do I mean by that? Because I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities, meaning that there's gangster inside of all of us. That's why I call him a gangster. When I call him a gangster, I'm seeing the gangster inside of me. And I have to wrestle with this civil war on the battlefield of my own soul. But when he grabs women's private parts or makes jokes about it, or talks about he's oil in another country, he's going to go get it, that's gangster. You call Mexicans rapists. Dishonor and demonize precious Muslim brothers and sisters. That's to me gangster. Now, that's an objective condition. That's not just name calling. You see, gangster activity is real. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know when we're gangsters too. So what does that mean? It means then you've got this kind of neo-fascism in the making of spirit, mind, structure, and institution. Big money ruling, big military ruling, and more hatred, more and more contempt, more and more demonization. And people are desperate, and we saw it in the 30s in Europe. We see it in Hungary today. We see it in Turkey today. We see it in India today. It's a global phenomenon of people looking for this strong man who will undermine rule of law, who will delegitimate democratic processes and practices. It is a very terrifying moment, but it's also a moment of possibility. Donald Trump is bringing out the best of America. You're seeing lukewarm folk waking up. You're seeing folks straighten their backs up. You're seeing courageous folks stepping out, wrestling with predatory capitalism, exploring what alternative. I don't think there's going to be an abstract alternative. I'm a Christian like yourself. Each human being made in the image and likeness of God. How do you keep track with their sanctity and their dignity? Beginning with the vulnerable ones. This is what our Jewish brothers and sisters taught us in Hebrew scripture. That hesed, spreading that loving kindness to the vulnerable, the weak, the fatherless, the motherless, those who are catching hell in the language of Malcolm X. So you start on the reservations in the states, you start in the ghettos, the barrios. It's the exact opposite under Donald Trump.
Lindsay, you're not that far away from the United States, in Canada, and I'm wondering, the questioner asked whether that kind of Trump infection, or the infection of these ideas that he identifies coming from Trump, would infect Australia. What about Canada?
I think if we're talking about infection, it's kind of interesting how Trump has to come into every conversation. I try to actively avoid talking about it just because I feel like it's kind of overexhausted sometimes. But so, I don't know, I don't have a lot to add about it. Part of my active avoidance. So don't talk about him and he might not exist? To be honest, I kind of like him. I think sometimes you have to shake things up a bit, and it makes you realize things you didn't see before. So, Erica Betts.
Look, with great respect, I think we got a very negative view of the United States. Your black brothers are in fact getting jobs, and sure, they mightn't be earning as much as you would like, but given that they've got jobs, they're better off than they were without a job. And surely you have to give a tick to that. And they're some of the things that I think that the people in the United States are responding to, if we are to believe some of the media and reports that Donald Trump's support is certain levels where Obama was at the same stage.
Well, it's an interesting issue, isn't it, Eric? Because what happened in the last 18 months of Obama's presidency was that 3.7 million jobs were created. In the first 18 months of Trump, 3.3 million. So you're actually seeing a trajectory that started a lot longer before the beginning of the Trump presidency.
Oh, look, everybody will say it was all Obama doing, but he was in the gig for 8 years, and it just seems to be a matter of coincidence that there's a change of presidency and all of a sudden the economy is going a lot better in the United States. And whilst there are certain activities of Mr. Trump in his private life, to which you alluded to, which are completely unsavoury, but I somehow didn't hear about Mr. Clinton. I
say the same thing about Bill Clinton. I'm not defending anybody acting gangster like
good.
Not at all. But let me ask this question, though. But you would agree,
a dark era?
Hitler and Mussolini had low unemployment rates. They made the trains run on time. We're talking about moral and spiritual issues, not just the numbers.
That's right.
Can I
say... You would agree with that?
It is a matter of regret. It is a matter of regret that you would put Trump in with a hideous regime of Hitler, and to try to get that moral equivalency is just a misunderstanding of the horrors of Hitler and fascism, and to try to equate the two.
No, I'm not making an equation. I'm not making an equation. I'm saying that if we only accent what you are highlighting, you're going to miss what was going on with Hitler and Mussolini. I'm trying to make sure Trump doesn't move into a Hitler-like Mussolini condition. Not yet. We don't know. He's still in the making.
Okay,
but I'm not making a moral equivalency. I want to make that clear on Australian television. Didn't make it. My dear brother corrected me if you thought I said that, but I didn't say that. But I'm saying the point. Okay. Keep the moral and spiritual.
I'm just going to move away from this bonding experience for a minute. Ali, so the questioner asked specifically whether the infection that he saw would come to Australia. And I suppose if you think about it, there's Brexit, there's Trump, there's the rise of the right across Europe. All of these things are, in a way, connected.
Oh, absolutely. I want to come to one of the points that Dr. West pointed out in terms of stagnant wages and inequality, and something that you said there, Dr. West, about talking about growth without talking about the distribution of that growth to our most vulnerable. Recently, Michael, there was an FBI report that came out that said that in times of economic crisis, we see a rise in white supremacism and in neo-Nazi movements, because it's I guess, a pattern of behaviour that when people feel that they are getting less, that they are more unequal, that the wealth is not equally distributed, they become more insular, they become more nationalistic, and you have the rise of some far-right and white supremacist groups. And we've seen Charlottesville, for example. In all of my lifetime, I never ever thought that I would ever see a neo-Nazi flag flown so brazenly in the streets in broad daylight. We're not immune here in Australia, certainly not. We do have a very different culture than in the US, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to be continually vigilant that inequality and the unequal distribution of wealth and disadvantage doesn't give rise to these elements in our society as well. OK, much more to talk about on this program. You're watching Q&A Live. High school students, the third Q&A high school special goes to air on September 10. Now, we're broadcasting live from the Australian National University with senior students filling the auditorium and the panel. If you'd like to be a high school panellist, go to our website now, upload your audition video. We'll bring the winning students to Canberra to take on the politicians in our National High School Special. Our next question comes from Liz Fanning.
Hello. My question is sort of addressed to the whole panel. So one of my friends is a student at the University of Sydney. I'm a student myself. I know, like, a lot of students, obviously. And last year he was at the he was at a stall at Sydney University displaying signs saying it's okay to vote no in light of the upcoming plebiscite on marriage.
Same-sex marriage.
Same-sex marriage, yeah, sorry. And he said that there was a lot of very aggressive behaviour, that there was people ripping the signs out of their hands, throwing glittering condoms at them, screaming abuse, and this went on for a lot of hours before any steps were taken to stop it. And I think from a lot of people that I know, this is an experience that seems to be quite common, and that non-left views are also being put down in classrooms, shut down without discussion. Do you think that if this is how one of the premier academic institutes of Australia is dealing with such vital points and issues, that we're heading for a more polarising and violent polity in the years to come?
We'll hear from the whole panel on this. Jeremy, start with you.
The short answer is I don't know. Part of your question is how representative was this incident that was described to you, I think. Now, I can speak from my own experience. I was involved in a debate about same-sex marriage just in front of the postal vote last year. There were 3 individuals who came along. This was at Macquarie University, and they wouldn't let the debate proceed. The other speaker spoke. I almost finished, and then right in the end of my speech, these 3 began shutting the debate down. And they were very clear that that's exactly what they were there to do. Their attitude was, this topic should not even be debated, at least not at a public university. Now, interestingly, there were people at this debate who, of course, wanted to vote yes, were determined to vote yes, including some same-sex attracted people. They came up to me afterwards and said, look, I'm so sorry about that. Now, as far as I'm concerned, they had no reason to apologise, and I told them that. So, of course, OK, 3 bad apples, so to speak. Nonetheless, it wasn't entirely unexpected. And I was not altogether surprised. I think, yes, there is great intolerance, not just at universities, but yes, at universities, for what are perceived as outrageous, horrible views. If you think about it, I was there to defend what was then the law of the land. And they said, no, we're not going to debate this. So I'm concerned. Whether this means society is going to get more fractured, more violent, I really have no idea.
Anne?
I'm sorry, what was your name?
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I think the incident that you described, I've heard a lot of similar incidences from the Yes camp as well. So I think that was a symptom of a very divisive debate that was had with this plebiscite, which was one of the reasons why Labor didn't want a plebiscite, because we knew that that would happen. I think this speaks to a broader issue, though, about the nature of debate generally in Australia and our ability to have debate in a reasoned and respectful manner. And I emphasise respectful manner. I think that with, particularly with the onset of social media, there has been a kind of a letting go of a lot of the kind of moral and ethical limitations that we put on ourselves in the way that we communicate in a respectful debate. And that's kind of been taken from the online world into the offline world, and how we debate and how we discuss issues that are contentious and sensitive and so on and so forth. I don't think the sky's going to fall down because of marriage equality. As you all know, I voted yes. I was very strongly a campaigner for the yes vote. I believe in marriage equality. If I want equality for myself, if I want to choose who I want to marry, I want to make sure that everybody else gets to choose who they want to marry as well. It's just that simple to me. But I think we need to be talking about the nature of debate in Australia and how we move forward with that.
Let me go to Lindsay. We'll come to the detail of your particular case in a moment, but of course you were teaching at a university and came across intolerance of different views. What do you think, listening to that question?
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of a lot of issues that are happening in universities in Canada. There just seem to be certain topics that you cannot question, where you're expected to have a certain position. Some of the ones that come to mind would be open borders, gender pronouns or anything to do with transgender people, indigenization initiatives, things like that, where there is a correct position that you must take.
Cornel.
Well, one, I think the students who tore the signs down were wrong. I think those who stopped you from speaking were wrong. I think the important thing is we have to be reciprocal in our dialogue, which is to say we have to keep track of both sides. We should be committed to a robust, critical, Socratic engagement of very complicated issues. No doubt about that. But at the same time, you see, because I look at the world through the lens of the cross for the wretched of the earth, you look at in the States where you had escalating vicious attacks on precious gay brothers and lesbian sisters, and especially precious trans folk. And when they are attacked, there's relative silence of those talking about free speech. I don't hear a lot of voices. Those folk have a sanctity and a dignity just like any other straight person, for me. Therefore, on the one hand, we defend yourselves and others who are concerned about the dialogue, the dignity of each voice. We must learn how to disagree, and disagree in such a way that we can still accent our humanity even as we have certain deep disagreement. Because we know friendship is always deeper than politics. Love is always deeper than politics. If you haven't discovered that, you don't know what love is, but that's another show.
Let's try Eric. Do you know what love is in that regard?
In relation to the question that was asked, what surprised me throughout that debate was that those that were allegedly asserting tolerance were in fact the most intolerant during the debate. And if I can just emphasise that, because there is this desire by a lot of people to stereotype everybody, so that if you're gay, it just goes to follow you must have supported same-sex marriage. I happen to have a staff member who is gay, who was actively involved in the No campaign with myself, and the vitriol that he was subjected to by other gays was just appalling, and yet they would be out on the streets and elsewhere saying, we want tolerance, vote yes, and then would behave in a manner simply designed to either bully somebody into silence or, in the case of the stall at the Sydney University, shut her down. And any institution that wants to be a genuine institution for learning, celebrating diversity of ideas, should have dealt with those students that dealt in such a bullying manner with their fellow students and said that is completely unacceptable, and I would have thought some disciplinary action should have been taken so that the ethos of the Sydney University could be upheld to say we are very interested in ensuring that everybody has their fair chance in putting their point of view. OK,
free speech is a core issue in this program. We've got more questions on it. We'll go deeper with them. Our next question is a video. It comes from Fiona Adolph in Perth, Western Australia.
Most reasonable Australians are tolerant and respectful towards vulnerable groups, including trans people. Just as the now commonplace title Ms was once rejected as a too radical substitute for Miss or Mrs, alternatives to him and her, words like zis and zim, might one day become mainstream. At the same time, the public service, Qantas, and even the ADF have moved to quash everyday words like him, her, mum, dad. But Lindsay Shepherd's case shows how regulations around language can cause well-meaning people to lose their jobs and stoke mob behaviour on both sides. Does the panel think that cracking down on everyday words serves the best interests of vulnerable or minority groups?
Lindsay, we'll start with you, and it's probably a good time for you to describe your case in brief terms anyway.
Yeah, so I was a teaching assistant for a course on communications, and in my class I showed a video featuring Jordan Peterson, who was taking the position in a televised panel discussion that he did not want to be compelled to use gender-neutral pronouns. And also in that televised discussion was another professor who was arguing that you must use gender-neutral pronouns because they're related to the dignity of trans people. So, both sides were presented. The clip that I showed was from public television in Canada. Yet I was taken into a disciplinary meeting for showing that clip and told that I'd created a toxic climate, I targeted trans folks, I had threatened trans folks, and I had violated the Human Rights Code, among other things, which was debunked. But
it was debunked by your own university when they investigated it, effectively. Were you told in the end that it was wrong, and were the people who rebuked you in any way punished for taking you to task?
So I was exonerated because there was a third-party investigation. They talked to my students and made sure that the discussion was handled properly. They released a statement saying that, showing video clips from public television is indeed acceptable in the classroom. So that was nice to know.
It was a debate. So you're showing a video of a debate, not dissimilar to the debate we're having here, but someone, one of your superiors, found against you for doing that. That's effectively what you say. That does sound like political correctness gone mad.
Yeah. I was told there were complaints, but I wasn't allowed to know the contents of the complaints or how many there were, despite me asking many times. And, what changed the narrative here, though, is that I secretly recorded the disciplinary meeting and I released it to the media. If I hadn't done that, this probably would have just been another disciplinary meeting where someone is told to get in line, and that's the end of that, they get in line.
So, just to clear this up, you didn't have any sort of agenda when you began this? Did you have a particular personal belief that this use of gender pronouns or the changing of gender pronouns shouldn't happen or should happen?
No, absolutely not. I just think it's an interesting phenomenon, and that week we were talking about grammar. And so I thought, well, aside from doing just dry grammar errors and what to avoid with grammar, maybe we can talk about how this is becoming a politicized issue and how, other languages like Persian, they already have gender-neutral pronouns in their language. So, how does that work and stuff? So
where's it? I'm just interested, where has this left you? Because your case has been a bit of a cause célèbre for the right. You've been brought out here by the CIS to tell sort of a warning, really, to other universities and to other countries as to what can happen if things go a bit crazy. But where's it left you? I mean, are you comfortable being a kind of campaigner for one side of the argument?
Well, I don't think free speech represents only one side of the argument. I do know that... people can, right away, people accuse me of being a closet conservative and things like that, and people would come up to me.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, but it was just interesting how quickly it happened. It was you're a far-right figure, you had a conservative agenda, you're a secret neoconservative, and it was just kind of confusing to me, because I still do consider myself a progressive. None of my political positions changed at all. And I like living in a progressive society. I just want to be able to question things like gender-neutral pronouns. That's it. That's all I want.
Cornel, listen to that. It's a pretty extraordinary case. You're at Harvard. Could something like that happen there?
Oh, it can happen anywhere. It can happen anywhere. Human beings are human beings at Harvard, any other place. And I think we have to be very morally consistent in terms of our support of persons who have been mistreated. But the irony for me is, 25 years ago, black folk, women, gays and lesbians were told over and over again, get beyond your victim mentality. You get beyond your victim mentality. You're always talking about being a victim. Now I hear my fellow right-wing brothers and sisters always talking about victims. I've been a victim. I've been a victim. I live in a country in which the vast majority of my white fellow citizens believe they are the most discriminated group. Now that's the triumph of Fox News. That the narrative has been one of victimhood, victimhood, victimhood. When I stood in front of those neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, and they spit on us, they cussed us out, and so forth and so on, they were presenting themselves as the victims of America. You see, when's the last time you saw the plight of indigenous peoples? When's the last time you dealt with domestic violence and discrimination against women? When's the last time you dealt with black people and brown people? All of a sudden now, our white brothers and sisters become the victims? Wow, is this Disneyland? Or
yeah, but
what's going on?
Cornel, I've got to get this straight. You're not suggesting Lindsay.
No, I would have defended my sister, but based on principle. based on principle, just like I defend black people based on principle. But when I hear the chorus of these folk as victim, no human being is ever solely a victim. We all are victimized in various ways, but as human beings, we can think, we can critique, we can resist. That's why we're committed to Socratic dialogue. I think that's what brings all of us together. Now, we end up in different places. Some of us are wrong. Some of us are less wrong.
Yeah.
You can be wrong.
I'm just going to ask Lindsay, do you feel like you're part of a Socratic dialogue at the moment, or do you feel the argument's sort of been turned a little bit?
I mean, I never wanted to position myself as the victim ever, but I definitely do see the phenomenon you're describing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
people were quick to, you know, our national broadcaster, there was one pundit who called me a crying white girl because in the recording I get a little bit emotional just about like the complaint situation and how I was so confused about it. But I never wanted to come off that way, but people kind of make that assumption. Yeah.
Eric, just very briefly, what do you think about the movement to get rid of gendered pronouns?
Oh, look, it's political correctness gone mad, and in relation to the question that was asked, in relation to Ms., that was never compulsory, and it was use it if you want to, and it's interesting, I do surveys of new electors, and it's amazing how many young women now, when how do you want to be entitled, now, from about 20 years ago, are writing Miss again. Rather than wanting to be known as Ms., they're now writing in, they want to be known as Miss. And so these things tend to have a life span, and then people go back. And look, our language is very rich, and him and her been around for a long time. Boys and girls have been around for a long time, and I suspect they will for a long time.
Okay, Anne, just very briefly, if we can.
With regards to...
Yeah, with regards to the personal pronoun issue.
I just think it's...
And, and the debate you've heard, which is an extension of the previous question.
Okay, so I'll answer the one on the pronouns. So I just think that if somebody wants to be called they or je or whatever, then just out of respect, call them that. It's no skin off my nose to call somebody whatever it is that they want to be called. It's not hurting me. It's not a huge impost on me. And out of respect for a fellow human being, to show them that that they are valued, I'm happy to do that. So that's my take on the gendered pronoun.
Okay, well, we'll come to some other issues in a minute. Just, Jeremy, on that subject.
I think that what Eric said was exactly right. One crucial issue is, are you making people do it? Are you forcing people to do it? The questioner used the phrase cracking down. Now, in New York, if I'm not mistaken at the moment, a landlord who uses what is taken to be the wrong pronoun can, in some cases, be charged something like, perhaps you can correct me here, $200,000 or so. That's the fine they face. We hear stories about universities, including the University of Sydney, that are saying to students, you will lose marks if you don't use neutral pronouns. Now, look, when I went to the University of Sydney, I did Jewish studies. That was my undergraduate major. And something we were told right at the outset was, look, please, in your essays, don't say BC and AD. Write BCE and CE, for obvious reasons. Now, I was perfectly happy to do that, and as far as I know, everyone else in the class was. It wasn't forced on us. There were no sanctions threatened. And as Anne says, it was a matter of basically of common decency. And yes, I don't see why it can't be very largely left to the common decency of ordinary people. I do actually have one more thing to say if there's time.
Sure.
This is where I may get myself into trouble. It's one thing...
That's why I said sure.
Of course. Enough rope, right. It's one thing if we're talking about using gender-neutral pronouns, if we're saying, OK, we're not assuming your gender, whatever that's supposed to mean, OK. It's another thing if someone who, as far as you're concerned, is very obviously a man is saying, I want you to call me she. Because, or vice versa, because in that case, I would say, look, you are actually asking me to say something which I don't believe. You are asking me to lie to you. Now, how is that respectful to you? Now, of course, in particular situations, in classrooms or in dealings with clients and so forth...
Can I just a quick interruption there? I mean, how do you know that person is not in transition?
Well, sometimes they may be, of course. Sometimes you know that they're not. I mean, it's made very public
How do you
that they're
know?
not. Well, no, when I say sometimes you know that they're not, I'm thinking, for instance, there was a period when Bruce Jenner, or Caitlyn Jenner, whatever you wish to call that individual, everyone knew there had been no surgery, no hormones, nonetheless, Woman of the Year. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the magazine that printed that was printing a lie. Now, unless you actually go full throttle on the gender theory and say, no, gender is purely a matter of what you define yourself to be, then there's a serious question here. Now, OK, that's another debate to have, a Socratic debate to have, by all means. But again,
I think, yes, you could. I mean, when I did give you the enough rope, you certainly took it.
Thank you.
And you want to respond to that briefly?
Well, I just think if you believe that somebody is a bloody idiot, but they don't, is it OK to call them a bloody idiot?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I just think, you know, is it up to us to decide other people's identities and what they want to be called? But if somebody came to me and respectfully said, look, I'd like you to call me they, or I'd like you to call me he, or I'd like you to call me she, honestly, it's not a big deal, as far as I'm concerned, to show that person that level of respect.
Yeah. All right, it is time to move on. So we, no doubt there's more to say on that subject. The next question comes from Gvanish Bhatia.
Senator Abetz, as a turban man, I've been following the debate around amending the Racial Discrimination Act, Section 18C. I follow this because discrimination against me on the ground of my race or religion is something that I need to be prepared for and consider on a daily basis. Why do you believe that it is okay to remove the protections that I have? Do you believe that bigots should have the right to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate another person or group of people because of their race or ethnicity?
Eric Abetz.
I believe in the right of free speech. It is a fundamental principle on which our society has been based for a long time. Should people go around offending people? Of course not. But should you have laws that allow people to say, I feel offended? Now, if it's incitement, then, of course, we have laws. But going to offence takes it that one step further, and in fact it's interesting when you have a look at the introduction of that legislation, which happened in about 1994. Green Senator Christabel Chamarette from Western Australia was in fact of the same view as myself, that what would happen in a few years' time would be that the thought police would deal with certain people, such as the students at QUT, the cartoonist Bill Leake, rest his soul, and other people which I don't think we should be putting up with in a free society that values freedom of speech.
So, Eric,
now,
just to bring you... Eric, sorry.
Race, no.
Just to abbreviate things a bit, one of the core questions there was, do you believe that bigots should have the right to offend? And bear in mind that your former Attorney General, George Brandis, said people do have a right to bigotry.
Well, look, you can have all the laws you like, and I think my brother here would agree with me, all the laws in the world does not, as of necessity, change what is inside the individual. And so all we can seek to do is modify people's, if you like, outward behaviour, and therefore, if they engage in racial vilification, then I think that is something that most of us would disagree with. I remember looking at some industrial history where in the 1930s people had advertisements outside their premises, vacancies, Catholics need not apply. Horrid stuff, which, thank goodness, our society moved on from.
But was that free speech, Eric?
Without the need for legislation.
OK, Eric, so I'm sorry to interrupt, because I just want to hear from everybody. Yep. So Anne Ali jumped in, so I'll let you
was that
pick
free
up the argument.
Because every time you call this about free speech and your rights, you are denying this gentleman and you are denying his experiences of racism. He's saying he has to prepare for every morning. You are denying the experiences of racism of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Australians. You are denying them their right to live peacefully, to live with respect. Every time you bring up that free speech argument...
What about the QUT students? What about Bill Leake? What about their freedoms?
Bill...
Okay, sorry, I'm just going to go back to our questioner. Gavanish, you've listened to two sides of the discussion here. You've heard Eric Abetz, so a quick response.
So my response to you is this. So you're saying, yeah, people will have those views, but people will also think twice when there is a law in place before they open their mouth to say something to me, right? So as any law, people will do it or people will break laws if they really want to do it. But because there's a law in place, there's some type of, there's something there that there's a protection there that if it does happen, there's something that I can do because it happened to me, right? If that's not there, I can't do anything. I just have to let people be racist.
Okay, let's go, before we get Eric to respond to that, let's go to the other panellists. And Cornel West, do you agree with your brother Eric?
No, he's wrong again. He's wrong again. But the dialogue is important, though. But I think what you have noted, and see, in the United States, for example, we had to have laws of accountability when it came to indigenous peoples, black peoples, brown peoples, and women. That's why you got constitutional amendments for women and black folk. Now, when it came to precious white Catholics who were discriminated against, you didn't need constitutional amendment for them. When it came to other white folk, you didn't need it. Why? Because in a white supremacist civilization, which is to say in a settler colonial experiment, United States, Canada, Australia, there's different examples of this. You need something stronger when it comes to those who have been cast as other in a fundamental way. In Muslims, women, indigenous peoples, they have a different status than the Catholics and others who have been discriminated against. Now, our Jewish brothers and sisters are an interesting case because when they arrived, they're neither white nor black in the States. They're not Goyim, they're not Negroes. What are they? They're Jews. It's a unique status. When they get to the Jim Crow bus, do they go to the front where the whites are? Do they go to the back where the blacks are? Now, if you're Jewish progressive, you went to the back, you're in solidarity with the least of these. Right? If you're Jewish liberal, you're wavering and lukewarm like most liberals. And if you're conservative, I'm going to assimilate. I'm American like everybody else. I'm like the Goyim. That's Norman Potterhore's 1967, which is just making it. Forget about justice. Just make your career your end and aim. So in that sense, we had to be very historically sensitive to different groups who do need laws as opposed to just a civic virtue that you and I do agree on. Civic virtue must play an important role.
Okay,
laws can't do it all
Cornel, let's ask Lindsay, because Canada was mentioned as one of those white settler experiments, along with Australia and the United States. What do you think?
Yeah, so isn't a big part of this changing humiliate, insult, offend into harass?
And intimidate.
Yeah. But the people who will make those kind of claims, those words all mean the same thing anyway. So I'm not sure how big of a deal the language changes, because they will just use those terms interchangeably.
It is significant because harass under a legal definition requires a consistent pattern of behaviour, whereas to offend can simply be one instance of offence. So there is a legal difference between the two.
It's also subjective.
Jeremy, what do you think?
I think a number of things. First of all, once again, yes, the law is a blunt instrument to be dealing with this sort of thing. Now, Cornel was talking about settler societies and the need for laws given the oppressor-oppressed relation. The 1995 Racial Hatred Act was passed, I'm fairly sure, in the wake of the multicultural policies of the 1970s and beyond. They weren't to do with Australia as a settler society. They were designed to deal with the fact that now we have an increasingly multicultural societies and a certain amount of tensions as a result. Now, I do think it's a serious problem, yes, that the law uses the word offend, that intention is not required and that offence is taken rather than by any clear standard given. I also think that, look, when it comes to everyday dealings with people, and of course you're not talking about things like violence. I mean, there are laws on the books for that as well, of course, but when it comes to everyday dealings, people find ways at the lower level, school level, university level, church level, to deal with the kinds of incidents that it seems to me you're mainly talking about. And those tend to work. I can speak from my own experience here. When children at school, if the school is well run, if children at school make racist remarks about Sikhs or about Hindus or what have you, the school deals with them. There's no going before the commission of any kind. You just deal with it and it works. Now, I'm not saying that's a perfect system. There's no such thing as a perfect system. I'm sure you'd agree. I do think that the obvious effects of the law as it is, some of which were referred to earlier, you have these hapless QUT students. Now, the university, QUT, did actually deal with them. It took down the offensive comments, and it could well have taken other disciplinary action. It might have been appropriate too. As it was, the complaint was taken to the commission, dragged on for 3 years, would have cost them a lot of money if lawyers hadn't done it for pro bono, and one of these students has now decided, I can't possibly be a teacher, which is what I wanted to do, because my reputation is probably in cinders from here on. Now, okay, you can say that's just one case, but it's a case that illustrates something about the nature of the law. A law that, as in some other countries, actually focuses on, okay, there has to be some intention. You have to be trying to insult, or you have to be intimidating. That, I think, would make somewhat more sense.
We're running out of time, and you want
I want to make a very
response
short point about this argument that offence is to be taken, not given. When you say to me, well, Anne, you're the one taking offence, I haven't given offence, what you do is you reinforce the power structure where you're the one who has to give offence and I'm the one that has to take offence. So this argument that offence can only be taken and not given reinforces a structure that enables the racism to happen in the first place. I think that we could discuss this more, and perhaps you and I can discuss this more about this whole idea
We'll
of
have to be in the green room, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
It's time for one last question. I'm sorry we are running out of time. It's from Marcus Campbell.
My question is for Cornel West, and thank you so much for your brilliant answers so far. Many of us Christians understand that the radical message of Jesus was made dangerous in his time by its opposition to the violent dominance of the Roman Empire and the supremacy of economic, political, and religious power. In our time of increasing wealth inequality, privatized faith, and different forms of violent supremacy on the rise, has the Church in the West lost the revolutionary way of Jesus? And how do we get it back?
Cornel.
I appreciate the question. No, I think part of the genius of the Christian tradition at its best, and this is a prophetic version, which is always a slice, because the Christian church is founded on the bones of Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times. So you have low expectations of such an institution. But that same Peter didn't deny that he had denied him, as Chesterton says, and he's absolutely right. He bounced back. The history of our species is the history of hatred and envy and resentment and domination and oppression. And what Jesus tries to do, coming out of prophetic Judaic tradition, is to break it, to interrupt it. And it's something that seems to be so weak in the world. Love is actually the most powerful when looked at through the lens of those who are willing to be crucified in order to bounce back, to learn how to die in order to learn how to live. That's what it is to be Christian, and therefore you always have relatively low expectations in terms of the overall project, but you have high expectations of the possibilities. That's what the cross is about. That's what Martin King was about. That's what Dorothy Day was about. That's what the great ones were. But now Christians, I speak as a Christian, of course, so I have my biases. I don't think we Christians have any monopoly on this. We've got Buddhist examples, we've got Jewish examples, we've got agnostic, and we've got atheistic examples. But the important thing is not to run out of gas. Don't allow the despair to have the last word. Don't allow the hatred to have the last word, even if what seems to be so weak and feeble, namely your commitment to a love of neighbor and love of enemy, to bear witness, and then to create some interruption. Democracy itself is a certain kind of love. Democracy creates an interruption of the dominant orientations of human history, monarchs, suzerains, elites, right across the board. The problem these days, the corporate elite function in some ways like the monarchs did. The oligarchs function like the monarchs. They don't want to be accountable. They're greedy. They want to seize the public square for their own private good. How do you account for the 1% having so much? They're so smart. Please. They work so hard. Please. But we don't want to take their money because we don't want to be violating their rights, we want to tell them, you're greedy and you got poor folk over here, and this distribution going upward over and over again flies in the face of the best of the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. It flies in the face of the Socratic legacy of Athens. Our pagans have something to say on this issue, too.
Cornel, I think the moneylenders are fleeing the temple as we speak.
Let them flee, let them go, let them go.
We'll have to we'll let you have the last word because I'm told we're out of time. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Lindsay Shepherd, Erica Betts, Cornel West, Jeremy Bell, and Aaron Ali. Thank you very much. Now, you can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Scott Wales is joined by Jahan Kalanta of Executive Lawyers. Next Monday, Q&A and the Melbourne Writers' Festival bring together leading Australian writers to discuss where reality ends and fiction begins, with the award-winning author of Tomorrow When the War Began, John Marsden, short story writer and author of The Hate Race, Maxine Beniba Clark, the author of The Lebs, Michael Mohammed Ahmed, Miles Franklin award-winning author of The Choke, Sophie Laguna, and journalist-turned-novelist Trent Dalton, whose new book is Boy Swallows Universe. Until next week, good night.